Welcome to the Mindfulness of Singing, and I'm Denise, your sassy, spunky scientist.
And I'm Tony, your bubbly, big-hearted flower child.
Our podcast features practical tips and tools for a journey of transformation using the healing power of your voice.
Each podcast, we will delve into the mind, body, and spirit connection by interviewing inspirational guests, sharing personal stories, and discussing the most recent scientific research.
Tune in and join our community of mindful singers.
Good morning.
Good morning, Denise. How are you?
I'm good. I'm having lots of coffee this morning.
Okay. Well, I'm not, and we're happy about that.
Oh, yes, that's right. She doesn't drink coffee. I don't understand it. Never will. It's, um, mm. But listen, I can't imagine what it'd be like if you gave her some.
I know. You know what? One time I had a group, an Italian study group, and one of the spouses said, "This is just an excuse to watch Italian movies and drink wine because it was hard to get them to get anything done." And a dear friend of mine,
Oh, the Italians? Come
no, no,
on.
no, these are Americans. No Americans. These are
Sorry,
Americans.
Italians, but it's true. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it
I
is.
love
Yeah.
my Italian buddies too. But anyway, this was American. And a friend was at my house painting, and it's a friend you know. And he spilled the beans. I'd been serving them decaf coffee all this time, and I never told him. And he goes, "So y'all are in there having that decaf?" And they went, they didn't know it. So anyway, side
That's
story.
funny.
But we better get to it because our guest is going to be here. So I've been researching about our guest, and her name is Petra Borzynski, and she's coming to us from the United Kingdom. And I'm excited. She has a very similar background to ours in that she's classically trained, she's performed, and she's a voice teacher. And along the way, she was struggling with some performance issues, and she felt like she was suffering a bit from imposter syndrome. And so she
Mm.
began to do, how can I help these people when I'm struggling, with my own
Oh,
issues
yeah.
coming? And so she went back and did a lot of psychology training, and she calls herself a therapeutic coach. I like that combination of terms. She has extensive psychology training, cognitive behavioral therapy, uh,
Oh, CBT.
somatic therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction in BDSR. So that's a lot of cool stuff that she's done. And she
Mm-hmm.
still sings, but she says she sings when she wants to and for the joy of it again. So it's an interesting journey. I think she's a wonderful person for us to have as our guest. And as I was researching about her, I wrote down two things that, well, I wrote down a bunch of questions, of course. I know that's shocking. And, but two quotes that came to mind. One is from a book that you and I both know. Back in the day, there weren't so many books about mindfulness or singing, very, very little. But one
Right.
that everybody, this will date us, knew was called The Artist Way. And
Mm-hmm.
in Julia Cameron's book, I had an artist circle, and I really
I
got,
own that book. Yeah.
yeah, and the whole thing. But anyway, one of the quotes that Petra uses on her website is from Julia Cameron's book, and it's this: Perfectionism is not a quest for the best. It's a pursuit of the worst in ourselves, the part that tells us that nothing will ever be good enough, that we should try again. Julia Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
Sad quote. And one of the things I want to talk to Petra and ask is, she says when she's telling her story and how she performed, and she had quite a significant background and all those things as well. And she said, um, where is it? Cue my never-ending search for perfection in singing, which is
Mm-hmm.
what led her to more psychology. And so those two quotes I wanted us to unpack in the sense that I can remember in my teaching, I'm not teaching now. I used to watch, I'm going to use the word I tried to avoid.
But wait, back up. Because you are teaching now.
Well, I
You
am.
just don't do it in the college setting.
Yes, not in a traditional studio. Yes, thank you, Denise. That's true.
So don't say that, because
That's
there's
not.
that little imposter syndrome that wants
Yeah,
to
yeah.
creep out of you
Thank
sometimes.
you, thank you, good
You
buddy.
are you're a good teacher, and you are a teacher.
Thank you. Did just last week. So yes, I mean, it's just not in the traditional setting. But anyway,
That's right.
Nothing is traditional right now for anybody. I'm not alone. So,
Yeah.
anyway,
And a lot of people are stuck in the traditional sense and would like to get
exactly. But the
out.
word
So,
that I words, as you know, are so important to me, and as a literalist, they're even, and my love for etymology, but a word that I I wanted to bring awareness to in my own teaching is try, because I think the word try assumes automatically that there's a chance for failure, whereas explore, experiment, inquire, investigate, play
hmm.
gives.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. That's good. I'll stop saying that with my students because I say, let's try this. How about this? Let's see if this works. Try that. Hmm. That's interesting.
I really, I, not to criticize your, and I'm sure I didn't always
No,
meant
I'm not.
that. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I don't take it that way at all. It's just I hadn't thought about try as being something where they're two sides of the coin. You either do it well or you fail. I hadn't thought about that word in that way.
Whereas explore, it's just exploring. Play is
Yes.
just play, inquiring, investigating. Oh, okay, good. I'm up for that. But try, I might, and being one who suffers from this a little bit, as you know, that implies, oh, I might not hit the mark. And I wonder
Mm.
if singing, what I want to talk to her about in her say, cue the never ending search for perfection, if all of our training creates in us, chicken or the egg, this sense of there's such a mark that, you can't get there.
Well, I think okay. So, I mean, I'm curious to see what she says about that, so I'm gonna hold off until I hear her say it, and then she and I will have a little debate about that because I think I have a pretty good answer, but we'll see.
Okay, cool. Well,
Hers will probably be better, but we'll see.
but there's
And
no
we may see it the same.
right, but you're exploring, and I think, in fact, here's another little side tangent. I've been listening to Steve Kotler on performance, peak performance, and they're they've shown that when you get in a flow state, it doesn't matter. Say you like skiing, and you go skiing for 2 hours, and you're in that flow state.
Hmm.
The benefits you reap from that in your job, in your creativity, in your interactions with your spouse or others it lasts for a couple of days. I mean, it's filling up the well, but there's scientific proof that that flow state isn't just for that period. And I think that this is a sermon that the bandwagon that we're on is play more, play, because when you play, you're actually working in a sense because you're creating that flow state. So, Denise, I can't wait for us to either do the Human Genome Project or Stephen Kotler's intensive, wild stuff that they do to create flow state through play. So, we'll get there when
Okay, I'm on board. Well, so yeah, that's a lot to unpack all of that. Yeah, I'm excited, and I'm excited about the fact that I do think that the space of classical singing is changing.
Mhm.
I think that we are becoming more concerned or more about the singer than the song, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes.
I I mean, I've had teachers who were really nurturing and didn't really worry about the details. And I enjoyed those voice lessons, but I also probably didn't learn very much. I got to hear myself sing, you know? And then I've had the other end of
That's
the
nice,
spectrum.
honey.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. And then I've had the other end of the spectrum where uh I can only sing 3 notes at a time
I was just gonna say you
before
couldn't note out.
they're already interrupting me and saying, and I despised those lessons, dreaded them, and decided and made a choice at that time that if I ever taught voice professionally, that I would not do that to a student, that I would let a student sing the song first and then go back and fix and tweak things. You know, yeah, go ahead.
That's where I'm sorry. That's where I was gonna say, are we creating that in the
Mm.
studio unintentionally by constantly correcting something, creating this sense of perfectionism? Are we unintentionally, you know.
Well, I mean,
There's
yeah,
a balance. There's a balance.
I think we all know the answer to that. I think the answer is yes, but at the same time, I think part of it depends on your personality. Part of it depends on your teacher's, or you and your teacher's temperament, both separately and together. And as you know, and in my opinion, a crowd of people can have a personality. Like I have classes, I teach the same class, right? It's the same syllabus it was last semester, but it's a totally different group of people, and that group will have a totally different personality
Group think. Uh-huh.
than the one before, so I mean, the energy within a room. And I think uh I have learned a lot from teachers who literally nitpick. I mean, my languages are as good as they are. And I mean, singing in another language other than your own, there's always room for improvement. No one ever gets perfect in every single language. We usually have one or two that we're better at. But I literally feel really solid about being able to sing in French, Italian, or German because I had a teacher who was so
Ridiculous.
stinking picky about the languages. I didn't learn shit from her about pedagogy. I didn't learn anything about singing. I learned about languages. So I, while I appreciate that, I feel like that I have had several teachers, I've had a lot of teachers, but I feel like I've had four teachers that if they could have been an amalgam into one teacher, I would have had a fabulous teacher, right? But each one of those people brought out a really great thing in my singing and a really good thing in my singing that I learned tons of stuff about that one thing from. And, I people, whether they realize it or not, I think they become specialists in things that they have a deep understanding of and they're really good at. So, the studio is it's a tough place. And you think about the difference between us and say a coach. A coach, and I'm talking about the sports world.
Mhm.
A coach in the sports world works with a group of folks. They don't really work one on one with for long with someone, not for an hour every week. There's no way a coach would have time to do that when you've got a team of people that they work with the team. And I think we're one of the few professions, music teachers, who work one on one with someone, and you have to deal with the minefield of the psyche. You have to deal with the mind, and that is a s- huge minefield, right? There are, uh,
The voice is one of the most vulnerable instruments. It's you.
yeah, but it's not just about the voice. I mean, okay, so a little bit of a story here. So this week I had a not a great not a great moment in a lesson with a young lady who is depressed,
Mm.
who is has anxiety issues, who is really meek and kind of whispers when she talks and tends to do that when she sings. She's a music ed major and she wants to teach high school. And I know those kids will eat her alive.
You
I
girl.
know that. I know that they will. But anyway, um and last semester she became very ill with an illness, not COVID, but something else, something actually worse than COVID.
Mm.
And she became ill and had to drop out of several of her classes to try to meet because she missed like for the first 4 or 5 weeks of school in the last semester. So she had to pop out of school. She came back in, and within the first week, before we even had a voice lesson, when we were just choosing repertoire, she's looking at me and she's about to cry, and she says, "I know I'm going to fail this semester." I know I'm going to fail. I already know I'm going to fail. And I'm thinking, who says that?
All
You
right.
have a, you have a clean slate. And I'm like, I don't have a lot of patience for that. Right. I'm just like, okay, okay, hon, whatever. I mean, I didn't say that out loud, but I'm thinking, whatever. So, I mean, it is, and that's a minefield that's not about the voice. That's about something else
That's the whole psyche. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
truly I'm not equipped to deal with. I'm trying to be, I mean, I'm taking psychology classes and whatever, but Lord have mercy. I would love to know what Petra has to say about that. Speaking of which, she's here.
Right. Well, let's bring her on in.
Okay. Hi, Petra.
Good morning,
Hi,
Petra. Or what? I say it's not morning for you, is it? It's afternoon.
it's afternoon, but it's
Welcome.
quite early morning for you.
That's all right. We're so glad to have you. We've just been chatting about you, and I've been telling your background and your stories. And we were just talking about an issue, and Denise said, "I'd love to hear what Petra has to say about that." And
Oh,
and here you are. So
okay.
so
Petra, I personally, and Tony is too, but I am extremely fascinated by what you do because you and I are walking, or you are doing what I'm trying to walk down a path to do right now. I don't know if Tony told you, but I am back in school. I'm teaching full time, but I've gone back to school for another graduate degree. I know it's dumb. People don't write me letters. And and I'm trying to get another degree in psychotherapy, and I love it. I love it. But and the only thing is I'm frustrated. I'd like to quit teaching and just do it full time and get it done so I can go do it.
Uh-huh.
So you are my idol.
Oh, goodness.
no pressure. No pressure. No, don't have any
No
performance
pressure
anxiety.
at all. That's it.
If you have any performance anxiety, we know who to recommend. But
Well, I've been there anyway. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I think we all arrive where we are in life because of our own personal stories. That's just what it is. So
right. And one of the ones I wanted to ask, which was a quote that you said, cue the never ending search for perfection in singing. Could you expound upon that a little bit more?
yes, I mean, I think you know a couple of things about me. I guess you've been on my webpage as well, and so on and so forth. And I think from a very young age, I always wanted to be perfect in the quotation marks. And I mean, obviously, we know that such a thing doesn't exist, but I guess it's ultimately trying to be in control when you have the feeling everything around you is not in control. And that was true for me for a very, very long time. And I always thought if I'm constantly improving, if I'm working on myself and so on and so forth, yeah, that will make me feel better about myself. But obviously, you're never arriving at that stage because it doesn't exist. So, yes, that is my own personal story as well. Definitely.
And what do you think? Was there a main thing that triggered you to change, or a main solution that helped you with that? Not that any of our listeners would ever struggle with anything like that, or anybody I know personally.
It's just human, I guess. Yes, I think for me, a big major changing point arrived. I mean, I was quite burned out, to be totally honest. I grew up in Germany. I lived there for the first 30 years of my life and mainly focused on my performance career. And everyone knows it's quite an unsettled life. And yeah, it's sort of you feel uprooted from time to time, or at least that was true for me. I mean, I don't want to suggest that's true for everyone, but it was true for me. And I think the turning point came when I just felt that both my mental and physical health were really starting to suffer, essentially. And I did the thing that I might not recommend to everyone. I basically burnt a lot of bridges and just up and ran to Scotland and left everything behind. But for me, in that particular moment, that was the best thing to do. It was really just, yeah, regrounding myself, finding what's important for me. And yeah, finding out about myself that the thing I thought was so important for me for such a long time actually was not what I wanted. And I
Yeah.
think that it takes a while to arrive at that stage. But and from there it just got better, to be totally honest. I think I needed to consciously remove myself from that environment that obviously wasn't good for me. And I think that's a scary step to take. And a lot of people probably thought she's totally nuts for doing that because it was going particularly well at the time. So I didn't leave performing when nothing was happening. It was exactly the other way around. So when everything was supposedly falling into place, that's when I decided, no, that's actually not what I want because it feels wrong. So yes, as I said, not suggesting everyone yeah follows my footsteps, and that one is maybe the crass thing to do, but it did help me. It really did help me.
I
Yeah,
got no problem with that.
yeah, me either.
I
Listen to
I
your
did
gut.
that. Yeah, Tony is kind of trying to do that. She's trying to run away to Italy and live, and I ran away. I ran away from home 2 years ago, and now it'll be 2 years for this summer. And I don't, every once in a while I have this little twinge of, but it's usually about the money because I was making a lot of money there, so I decided, that money wasn't the most important thing to me. That my mental health and my sense that I was doing something that I felt was ethical and all of that was more important than the money. Every once in a while, when I see a beautiful pair of Gucci shoes, I'm like, damn, I wish I still made that money. But overall, I think it was a good choice.
Exactly
I think
that.
a lot of people run. I think a lot of people run away from home, and to put it lightly. But I think a lot of people uh, decide that the only way that they can be mentally healthy and in a better place is to walk away from their current situation and their current surroundings. It takes a lot of bravery and a lot of courage to do that.
Yeah, and strangely looking back on it, I don't even feel it was particularly courageous or brave. That's the strange thing as well, because at the time, I just felt like I'm running away from something. So it felt probably the exact opposite. But then in hindsight, you just notice it was actually the right thing to do.
Mhm.
And I think it's one of those things about maybe trusting our intuition a bit more often, which so many of us have learned to ignore. And
Mhm.
we believe in all these stories that we make up about our own lives that other people are planting in our brains
Mm.
as well. And I think to consciously remove yourself from that, I think is a path that sometimes is worth walking. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Changing the narrative is super important, I think, especially when the narrative isn't the truth.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know that Tony has another question because I can see it. She's forming the words, but I want to back up just a little bit and tell us what made you decide to go from a professional singer with a music degree or whatever. Did you have a master's in music
Yeah.
or bachelor? Okay, so you
It's
got a
sort of,
master's.
I mean, the system is a tiny bit depending on when you were born as well, because I'm obviously ancient. So at the time I was studying in Germany, we didn't have the master's and bachelor system yet. So it is some sort of postgraduate degree, which we call diploma, which by today's
Yes.
standards would be a master's, but you study it like all the way through. So it's not like, okay, you do your bachelor's first and then you have your standalone degree if you want to stop there. So you basically go to university for 6 years. For most, it actually takes longer, but that's the minimum. And that's just like one way through. And if you stop halfway through, that's it. You don't even have a degree to show or anything. So, but they stopped doing that, which is maybe a wise choice as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you're singing, you leave Germany, you head to Scotland, and you go, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna get a psychology degree. It or something like that. What are your credentials there, and what on earth made you decide to do that?
Well, I think it's a mix of wanting to understand myself better, and then also because I made the very conscious choice to remove myself from following performance any further. And because I always felt, even when I was still in Germany, that coaching and teaching was something that was very close to my heart. And I felt I always wanted to do more of it. And I never felt I had enough time for it. I always felt, I mean, there's people out there who do both at the same time and do it very well. But I never felt that was quite true for me. I always felt one or the other was suffering. And in that case, for me, it was the teaching. And so I decided I wanted to teach, and yeah, just wanted to find out more. And I think one of the first things I did was yeah, enroll in a diploma for coaching and mentoring, it was called, just to understand more about the coaching process and not feel like an imposter when I start teaching and coaching. And I think it just took off from there. It was just, I felt immediately, this is my world. And from this cognitive coaching sort of diploma that I did, I then started studying psychology. And then it moved on from there to cognitive behavioral therapy. And then you feel like, it's not all yet. And then I went on to sort of look into different modalities, somatic therapy as well, and acceptance and commitment therapy. So yeah, it's just never ending. I just feel like I still want to get another 10 degrees in that area, but I
You
think I
guys
might
have
stop
fun.
at some point.
That's so funny because that is so me. I am a lifelong learner, and I would
Mhm.
if it wasn't super expensive and time consuming, I would be in school all the time.
Yeah.
I
Me
love
too.
learning too, but I don't desire for another
Yeah,
degree.
no, but I love the classroom. I love to be in a classroom with a really smart teacher. I like that a lot. But it's funny because I didn't like it in my undergrad, but you know,
Mhm. I think it's just when you find the right thing. I think that's when you just feel like you want to learn more and learn more. Although it's also a slippery slope, because obviously at some point you just need to say, okay, it's good. I'm
it,
ready. I don't need to learn more all the time, because I mean life is learning. But I think for me, particularly, yeah, with the psychology qualifications, I think it's a bit like singing in parts, or you know it yourself. In singing, people sometimes can be very particular about, okay, what is the right system, what is the right method, and so on and so forth. And that to a degree also holds true in the psychology world, if you know what I mean. So the cognitive behavioral therapists say, oh yeah, this is the way, of course. And then your Gestalt therapists say, this is the way. And I think I always had a problem with being too prescriptive, because I just like seeing the person in front of me and feel like, what are they like? What might be helpful for them? And for some people, this top-down approach that you have, for instance, in cognitive behavioral therapy, works really, really well. And it's something, yeah, that straight away falls into place for them, because it's very structured. And people who
right,
like having everything in order and having a system to adhere to, and so on and so forth, I think they immediately connect with that type of coaching and therapy. But there are other people for whom that doesn't work at all. And I
mm,
think to then try to press them into a mold is just something that never really work for me. So I felt like, no, there must be more out there. And then I looked into the sort of more bottom-up approaches, like somatic therapy, for instance, which is a completely different way of working. And also that doesn't work for everyone.
right.
And so, yeah, it's
Just
sort of
like
like,
voice, not
One
everything that
size doesn't fit all for
no,
everything.
it doesn't.
And
So, okay, I have a question. In the CBT world, who's your dude? Is it Beck? Is it who do you like in the CBT world? Like who's which one of the fathers of that do you like?
I
I think
like
she's pretty.
Beck, but I feel like for me, I've almost moved on a bit from the sort of, yeah, let's call it mainstream CBT,
Hmm.
because as I said, it is very prescriptive. And
Yeah.
I really like Stephen Hayes, for instance, which is more sort
Hmm.
of acceptance and commitment therapy. So um, you have a stronger behavioral component in that. I mean, you obviously you get different folks in all of them as well. Some in the CBT world who focus more on the cognitive element, and some who focus more on the behavioral element, and so on and so forth. Um, so yeah, I think. As I said, it sounds a bit harsh to say I've moved on from it a tiny bit, but I just feel
Yeah.
like yeah, that this hardcore sort of reframe your thinking can sometimes be very, very guilt-inducing for some people. Sort of
Interesting.
as if
Interesting.
everything that's going on in your life is somehow down to the way you think, which
Right.
then in a way
Distorted
means it's your
thinking.
fault.
Yeah, that you're distorting the truth, you're distorting thinking. And I mean, there are students and people who tend to distort things. I mean,
Oh
that's
yeah,
it can be a
absolutely.
temperament, it can be a temperament thing that's just or nature versus nurture, who know? Were you in a household where somebody was always distorted in their thinking and you learned it, or are you bent towards that in some way? But yeah, no, distorted thinking is, and how you fix the distorted thinking and you help somebody see their distorted thinking is what CBT is, for those of you who don't know what we're talking
Cognitive
about.
behavioral therapy, in case anybody's lost. Okay, just y'all throwing out those buzzwords. My background is music therapy, and I
Yeah,
think that's where.
terrible.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Okay. And so what is somatic therapy? What is that? Tell me what that is.
Well, while in sort of cognitive behavioral approach, or basically in most talk therapies, actually, you work top down. So literally, you're aiming maybe for those ones who aren't quite so versed in this type of lingo as well. What you basically do, you aim at the brain structures that are mainly concerned with, let's call it, rational thinking. So that is the prefrontal cortex. So you try to get in there by looking at people's thinking patterns and helping them to reframe them a tiny bit, and so on and so forth. And in somatic therapy, it's the other way around. We call this the bottom-up approach. So you aim at the brain structures that are more, yeah, sort of responsible for your emotions, for, let's call it, your instincts as well. So for instance, you're in somatic therapy, you will help people to feel safe in their bodies first before you even look into
Mm,
what are their thinking patterns like. So it's very, very hard for someone, for instance, who's yeah, let's say a trauma survivor, to
mm,
straight away
mhm,
go into the rational thinking and
mhm,
try to sort of help them that way. So sometimes what's needed is actually not they feel safe in their bodies first, that you go into those responses first, and then you can sort of aim for, yeah, let's call it dual awareness and of sorts, so that then once the safety is established, you then also can maybe look at the thinking patterns. So at the end of the day, you're really aiming for the same thing, but you're going on about it in different ways. So one is the more, let's call it, rational approach, and the other is the slightly more instinctive approach, where you're literally aiming more at the limbic system and the brainstem as opposed to the prefrontal cortex.
Very
I like
good.
that. That's cool. Yeah.
So let's say someone has performance anxiety. Can you explain the difference between state anxiety and trait anxiety? And should they see a therapist or a coach?
That's such a tricky question because it really depends on the individual and their backstory. I always like to say that not everyone who experiences performance nerves really also has performance anxiety, because if we're looking into that in more depth, there's obviously clinical markers for that. And not everyone who feels nervous before they're going on stage has these markers. So first and foremost, you usually need to have it for at least 6 months to be sort of like clinically diagnosed. But also, I think a really important thing is to keep in mind that nerves are just normal. And if we're sort of shining lights on them too much in the studio, we sometimes can, yeah, turn things into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's a very, very fine line to walk. So I would always say it really depends on how the individual presents, if it's more of a coaching approach, or if you would really suggest this goes a bit deeper and that person actually needs therapy. Normally we say to develop musical performance anxiety, that really sort of is more like a subset of social anxiety, and that would then need therapeutic intervention. You would need to fulfill criteria. So that's also what you're hinting at with the difference between state and trait anxiety. So state anxiety is just really like, yeah, in the moment, and you're worried about something, and that can affect you in different ways somatically, like sweaty hands, racing heart, all of these things. Cognitively, sort of when your mind races and you make up all these horror scenarios about your future, and no one will give me a gig anymore ever in my life, all these things. And then behavioral, maybe sort of trying to avoid the situations, and or getting into coping patterns that are maybe not so helpful. Um, what you usually see in people who have the deeper problem, where you would say maybe you move away from the coaching approach and you would start to think about therapy, is obviously if it affects their life very, very severely. So it's literally not just, yeah, right before you walk on stage, you feel nerves, and maybe they affect your voice as well. But generally speaking, it's not out of proportion in any way. So the voice is maybe shaky for a minute and then you can get on with it. But you would say that people are psychologically vulnerable. So they maybe made adverse childhood experiences of some sort. So the way they look at the world, they do that through a very particular lens, essentially. So that makes up the psychological vulnerability. When as a child, you essentially learn that something is not safe and you didn't feel safe. Then obviously in people who have the deeper rooted anxiety, there can also be a biological element to this. So could be hormonal, um, could be a couple of other things. I mean, genetically, even there's a recessive gene that we think might be responsible for experiencing anxiety more severely. So that could also play into that. And those two together are usually enough to experience trait anxiety. So to develop something like generalized anxiety disorder. But to experience music performance anxiety, you very obviously also need the trigger. So you need to, yes, start experiencing anxiety that is linked to a very particular situation, in that case, going on stage and doing your performance. And that is much closer to a phobia. So
Mm,
than it is to what we, for instance, would perceive as general anxiety disorder. So that's why a lot
interesting.
of clinicians also say music performance anxiety is actually a subset of social anxiety and social phobia. And indeed, there seems to be a correlation between the two. Doesn't mean that if you have social anxiety, you also have to have music performance anxiety or vice versa, but they are more strongly correlated actually than someone having music performance anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder. So they're much closer together. So, and then obviously, if you have these three things together, the biological vulnerability, the psychological vulnerability, and the anxiety that is linked to a very specific situation, then if people are suffering quite severely, you would obviously say, okay, just coaching you might not be quite enough. We need to look at this in a bit more detail. We might also need to go into your past a tiny bit, as opposed to just focusing on what's happening now, and which is more of the coaching approach. It's more present focused, and then you set your goals for the future. So I think for me, that's always the main difference between therapy and coaching, because so many people want to draw a hard line, really. And I think they're very often much closer together than so many people want to let on, and the lines are very, very blurred. But that was always a main reason for me, or a main sort of difference, that we maybe look at people's past a tiny bit more and help them to unravel this, if it's safe, if they're in the state to do that. Obviously, that's a whole other subject. Because especially if you think of people with trauma, obviously they need to be in a stage of their lives where they actually can and want to process the traumatic experience, and not everyone is at that stage. And so that's something we need to look into in very much detail. And as I said, so there's no hard and fast rules. We need to look at the person right in front of us, and then basically see, okay, what would be individually the most helpful thing here.
Beautiful.
Wow.
There's a lot of good stuff in there, and it's affirming, because that's what I would frequently would say to my students. I've got a problem. I think, well, no, that's pretty normal. If you're nervous, it's actually going to help you get into flow state. You don't want to be so chill that you're not even perked up a little bit. There's a balance, but anyway, you affirmed what I thought in my gut, and you with your training have affirmed. So, and I hope that's helpful to our listeners too. If you're wondering, well, do I need help or do I not? Where you are on that spectrum. And so thank you. That was really good. And also I was going to ask about a little bit more about therapy and coaching, but you kind of covered that. And I was interested to hear you say on one of your podcasts or YouTube something that sometimes there's a rivalry is not a good word. Maybe you can help me find a better word, but a little bit of a looking down upon, you know, therapists, a coach saying, you just need to buck up and do it. You don't need therapy, or vice versa. But
Yeah.
it depends on the person in front of you. And that's a great
Oh,
answer.
and I think it's just not helpful. I mean, you just need to imagine the person who maybe really suffers from performance anxiety to quite a big degree. Um, if they're then basically being told, it's diminishing their experience in a way. They feel enough guilt and shame anyway, and then to say, you don't need therapy, or you do need therapy, or you need to do it this way, or you need to do it that way, and there's only one way to go on about this, and this whole sort of like what I sometimes call therapy bashing, which you see in particular corners of the coaching world, not all, obviously, but it is dangerous. It's really, it helps no one, and you don't want to induce more guilt in people who are already at a point in their lives where they're struggling enough as it is, and they're
Yeah,
looking
it's
around for
not only dangerous, it's ignorant.
yeah, absolutely.
It's ignorant.
Yeah.
It's really
Insulting.
ignorant.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I remember way back when, Petra, it's hilarious. So many of the folks that come on here that say, "Oh, I'm so old," and Tony and I are like, "What?" Because we are probably a bit older than you are, and so I really remember back in the day, when I had a student who came in and. Every week it was a tear fest. Like she couldn't get through a lesson. And it wasn't because of me being harsh. She would cry and say, I just can't hit this note, and I know that I'm terrible, and she wasn't terrible. And no matter how many times I said, you have a lovely voice, it was the same every week. And I finally just said to her, I can't help you. You have to go get some therapy. And you're talking about something that is way out of my expertise, and I want to help you, but it's unethical for me to try to help you because I don't have the training or the expertise. And I strongly urge you to seek out some help and get some therapy. And she did, and she got better. But so anybody, I can't imagine anyone in 2021 who would be so ignorant to say to a student, you don't need therapy. You just need a buck up.
You'd be surprised.
See, that would make me walk right out of their studio. I mean, I would be like, "Oh, well, okay. I don't we're done here." I mean, that would be but, I that I'm a problem sometimes. So
A rebel
so
child.
I'm a
Mhm,
troubled child,
mhm.
which by the way, um, you know, I have a little bit of now I realize it's a phobia, not an anxiety, but I have a little bit of a phobia about when I perform, I'm scared to death that I'm going to forget words. I'm not afraid of my voice. I know to work. Singing is easy for me in those regards. I don't struggle with, my range or any of that. That's all going to be fine, but I worry about memory slips, and I worry about them in such a degree, or I used to worry about them in such a degree that I would try not to do things that required me to memorize the music. I'd have to do recitals. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't know, operas are different in so many ways. I think because you rehearse for 6 weeks and there are people around you who are like gonna help you if you can't remember a word, or there's you have a memory slip or something. But it's those things like, recitals where, you have to memorize in four different languages and all the bit, and and it's so intimate, and I would so worry about that. And I was listening to a podcast with a therapist who was talking about, and Tony knows this because this is in our book, but I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about regressive memory and doing some regressive therapy and some uh, you know and I mean, I'm driving a car and I had to pull over because it took me back to a thing that happened that I had not thought of in years, that happened to me when I was 5.
Mhm.
And I knew in that moment that that was why I had such a fear about forgetting words on a stage.
Well, you
Because as
have
a
to know.
5-year-old, I had done it and was completely shamed over it.
Mhm.
And uh and I knew that was what it was, and it seems so hilarious and so silly, but at the same time I knew that that was some little subconscious thing that every time so I was really empowering to realize that that's where my phobia came from.
Mhm.
And
And it's interesting
anyway,
what
so
you say there about sort of yeah, this being sort of literally how you process your thoughts. But I think let's just really put the finger right on it. It's also a very visceral experience of sorts, and that's where the somatic approaches are so interesting because it is a type of trauma. I mean, when we are sort of thinking of trauma, I think many of us still just think about what some people refer to as big T trauma. So we're thinking of accidents and big
yeah.
catastrophes, that type of thing. Um, but it's not. I mean, traumatic experiences can really be, it's not the event that is necessarily the trauma. It's your ability to process it in the moment that causes the trauma. And
Right.
especially children in that
Yeah.
way are so vulnerable. It can just be something small, really. I mean, recently something that came up is just like a visit to the doctors essentially, and sort of experiencing a certain pain, and they weren't even aware that this is what they'd been carrying around for so long. And so it's really, I think it's not just like how you think about stuff, it's also the survival response that comes up in your body every time this memory is triggered in a way. So when something reminds you of what happened to you as the 5-year-old, and no matter how, yeah, out of this world this might seem to some people,
Mhm.
that will activate this memory trace, and then your body responds in exactly the same way again, either with a fight or flight response or with some sort of freeze response. I mean, that's what our bodies are hardwired to do, and it's
Yeah.
so interesting to look at these things. So it's really, it's not just mental, it really is also physical. It is really deep in our bodies. So yeah.
Do you
Whole
Mhm.
do you use hypnotherapy at all to treat things like that in your
No, no.
practice?
I
You're
mean, I've looked into it, but I'm not qualified in it, and that would just be not staying in my lane, if you know what I mean. There's people that are more qualified to use that than me, so it's nothing I personally do. No.
It's powerful, I think, if you can find somebody who's got a certification or something like that in it or has training in it, I think it can be quite powerful, but yeah.
I assume that most of your clients that come from a singing space come for either performance anxiety or perfectionism of some sort. Is that the main thing that you see?
Yes, yes. It's sort of, I mean, performance anxiety is obviously a really big part, but it's also sometimes people who just have the sensation that they're stuck somehow and they can't quite put their finger on it. And they maybe have, yeah, repeated thought patterns about not being good enough, not doing the right thing, and they struggle to overcome them. So it's sometimes also the more, yeah, I don't know how to put it. The thing that's maybe not so obvious, where you don't go straight away, okay, this is someone who struggles with performance anxiety, but rather people who feel stuck in certain ways and feel it's getting into the way of living either their private or professional lives, or a combination of the both, basically to their fullest. And yeah, I would say that's the two biggest groups.
Well, and I would like to quote something that I read from Petra Borzynski about that very matter. And it says that perfectionists um, have performance anxiety, but the majority of people with performance anxiety are perfectionists may not have performance anxiety, but the majority of people with performance anxiety are perfectionists.
Yes. Is about this link again, where we say that there's a very strong correlation between perfectionism and performance anxiety, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're a perfectionist, you will also get performance anxiety, or that as someone who has performance anxiety, you have to be a perfectionist in each and every case. It's about the thing, causation versus correlation, and so on and so forth. But we see a very strong correlation between the two. And I think it makes sense in a way if you just look at, certainly from my own experience, when I remember myself as a young performer, I think it's this constant fear of messing up that gets you into this place, and this constant belief that there's still something that needs to be improved, that there's still something that's not quite right, um, that everyone will find out you're a fraud of sorts, if you know what I mean, this imposter syndrome, which is also linked to these perfectionist thoughts. So it is a very, very strong correlation. And I also see that in my coaching clients, most of them, for instance, who have performance anxiety, they are perfectionists, so you could say so. They always want to improve. They always want to do it better. They're always worried about not doing it 100%. So it's really quite strongly linked.
I know people like that.
Don't we all?
And do you
Praise
ever,
God.
last one, I know we've got to let you go. This is just for a friend, just hypothetical,
This is not the last one. This is her, and then I've got a
My
question.
last one, excuse me, my last one. Okay. You know how someone goes to the doctor and they say, I've got this friend. Well, I've got this friend who doesn't necessarily struggle with performance anxiety when it's a role or a concert or a recital, because they love if they can get into it's me, can get a space of play. But when it comes to recording, I've had this now happen a couple of times. I feel I'm ready and I share it with different people, different spaces, and say, yes, you are so ready to record. This is going to go so well. And then I start recording and it's what's going on? Why is there a disconnect? And I'm gonna have to process something after this with Denise. I just had a memory as you were talking, something to think about. But do you ever find people that have performance anxiety, say in a recording session situation, but don't for a performance? Do you ever see any kind of disparity in that?
Yes, and vice versa as well. So I mean, again, it's hard to say what could be at the root of it in the individual case without really looking into it in more depth. But I think for some people, for instance, if you say like, I'm not that worried about going on stage and so on and so forth, but I am worried about recording. Um, One question to ask, for instance, what is there in terms of, yeah, let's just call it timeline, how long things are available, for instance. Because if you're going on stage, you're not listening back unless someone records as well and you're aware of it. The question would be, are you then also more nervous if you know there's a video camera somewhere or something? Um, so that would be one thing. If you feel like it's out there for all eternity, so to speak, maybe that puts more stress on you than thinking this is just something that's there for a fleeting moment and I can't get it back. I can't listen back to it either. It just happens and then it's gone. It's not permanent, or at least we have this illusion it's not permanent, while we feel like if we record it, be it just sound or be it video, it is there for everyone to see and tell apart, and they can rewind it and they can pick it apart in the smallest detail. That could be one reason, for instance, out of many. So yeah, it definitely is true. So it doesn't have to be the same in each and every performance situation. There's people, for instance, who are totally fine when they're singing, but if they have to give a speech, they fall
Mhm.
apart.
Mm. Mhm, mhm, mhm.
I've just joined an Italian Toastmasters club. I love to speak Italian, and I've been just shocked because I have a friend that I've known now for several years. He's an otolaryngologist. He's a brilliant man, retired, and he stutters. And but in this setting, when he's giving speeches, I haven't heard him stutter once. But being in his home to tell me to go to the kitchen to get something, he would stutter, and just in a calm situation. I'm finding it absolutely fascinating. So yeah, I guess what situation provokes what response.
Mhm.
Anyway, Denise's turn.
Oh, okay. I almost forgot what I was going to ask, but now I remember. Okay, so tell me what a coaching session looks like with you. So, are you doing a voice lesson and then doing things into this, getting to the psychology of it, or do people come to you who study with someone else vocally and say, "I'm struggling with this," and you are strictly on the in the mind and the body paradigm? Tell us what that's like.
I mean, I think you can never fully separate the two anyway, but I'm a bit of a strange bird in that way. I like to keep them as separate as I can. So if someone is my voice student,
Mm.
um, I tend to, as I said, it's not totally possible to keep the psychology out of it, as we all know. But I
Oh.
try to keep it as separate as I can, because for me, it's different work. And I'm totally aware that not everyone will agree with that. But
Mhm.
I like to say, okay, no, if you feel you want to work on that in more depth, we're just going to take that out of the singing situation and just have the psychological work separately. So we're not doing that in the same session. And then it would obviously depend also on whether it's more of a coaching approach or more of a therapeutic approach or the thing in between. I always like to refer to myself as a therapeutic coach, if that makes any sense, because I like the coaching process. I'm really quite fond of it. But obviously, as I said, there's a weird blurred line that you obviously need to be aware of. So, and for some, it will be more therapy related, and for others, it will be more of a coaching approach. But it will be a session where we're really just working on coaching or yeah a therapeutic approach on your anxiety or whatever that might be that we want to look into. And then which approach is taken would also depend again on the individual. So whether we're taking more of the top down approach that I already talked about, for instance, like acceptance and commitment coaching or therapy, or whether we're having a bit of a somatic approach, or what I sometimes do with people is that we're going into the somatic approach first to
Mm.
establish the safety that I already talked about, and then we're maybe moving over in a sort of more cognitive approach. But it will be separate from the singing, so I don't do both in the same session.
Wow, that's great.
Okay, this isn't a question like you think it's a question, but if our listeners want to work with you and to tell us how to get in touch with you and tell us the latest and greatest things going on in Petra's world.
The latest and greatest things in my world. Well, if people want to get in touch with me, I have a website that's singingsense.com. So singing sense, one word, and .com. So that's where you can literally find out everything about me and how I work and who I am. And what's going on in my world. Yeah, a lot of stuff at the moment, essentially. I'm sort of prepping my own courses again for people. I work with a lot of private and also corporate clients. Sort of like I work as a cognitive behavioral coach for speakers as well. So it's not just the singers. And so, yeah, very, very busy at the moment. So I'm hoping that I can get a couple of group classes out there again and webinars. And there's a few lined up already, probably around about May. But yeah, a lot of stuff going on, both in my private coaching world and also, yeah, with regards to involvement with others. Some of them are still under wraps, so I can't say too much about them before the organizations in question sort of do the first move, so to speak. Yeah, but very busy indeed at the moment with lots of different stuff. But I always like to do a mix of yeah, webinars, and maybe also for teachers who would like to sort of find out more about how to help their own clients without overstepping boundaries. So that's a lot of work I've done in the previous year, for instance, when the pandemic came upon us, so to speak, and a lot of people were looking into a lot of professional development, because I think that's something that's quite important to me. Because there's a lot that the singing teacher can do, or the vocal coach, to help people with nerves or anxiety, or even generally speaking with their mental health. But there's obviously also boundaries that need to be in place. And that's something that's quite near and dear to my heart. And that's something I did quite a lot over the last year, run webinars and classes and workshops. And I'm still in the process of still doing that as well.
Beautiful. Well, she has a lovely website, and as you can hear, she's well versed and would be a great person to work with if you're a singer struggling with any of those issues. So get in touch with Petra, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And I'll get in touch with my friend that I was asking about, and I'll tell her your tips.
I think her friends should have a couple of sessions with you, is what I think.
You know where to find me.
Thank you so much, Petra. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. We are very grateful that you joined us today.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe, write a review, share it with a friend.